Simmons. Aisha is also an activist. I think we all are cultural workers, is what Tony K. Bombara would call us. We are all cultural workers. And one of Aisha's preeminent and very important projects is the documentary No. Which is a rape documentary about rape of Black women. So Google her and seek and find her as well. So they were both surprises. If I'd known they were coming, they would have been up here instead of out there. But
next time. Next time.
Next time, yes. And we hope there is a next time. We hope to be able to that this was just the first year, and that we'll be able to do this again. So I'm planning on it. Are y'all with me?
Yeah.
Woo! So both of these women probably don't need an introduction, but I have one, and I really want to let you all know, if you don't know who they are. This is our keynote for today, a conversation between Carolyn Finney and Bell Hooks. So Carolyn Finney is a writer, performer, and cultural geographer.
She tries her best.
And when I was reading her, honestly, when I was reading her bio, I'm like, well, I need to take this out because I don't even know what that means, or maybe I should leave that in and let her tell me what it means. But as a professor in geography at the University of Kentucky, she is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. In particular, she explores how issues of difference impacts participation in decision-making processes designed to address environmental issues. Carolyn is both an artist and an intellectual. She pursued an acting career for a decade, but a backpacking trip around the world and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Carolyn has appeared on the Tavis Smiley Show, MSNBC, NPR, and has been interviewed for numerous newspapers and magazines. Most recently, an interview with Carolyn in the Boston Globe was cited as one of the top 10 idea stories in 2014. Along with public speaking, writing, and consulting, she serves on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board that is working to assist the National Park Service in engaging in relations of reciprocity with diverse communities. Her first book, which we have back there, called Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014.
Yes.
By and then we have our preeminent Kentucky intellectual feminist, sister friend Bell Hooks. Acclaimed intellectual, feminist theorist, cultural critic, artist, writer, mentor, and like I said, sister friend.
Yes.
Bell has authored more than 30 books and has published works that span several genres, including cultural criticism, personal memoirs, poetry collections, and children's books. Her writings cover topics of gender, race, class, spirituality, teaching, and the significance of media and contemporary culture. Her books are too many to name, but these are some that I'm sure you've read. Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism.
Yes.
Rock My Soul, Black People and Self-Esteem. Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, which was like my teaching Bible. Feminism is for Everybody. Passionate Politics, Teaching Community, a Pedagogy of Hope, Where We Stand, Class Matters, and We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity. She is Distinguished Professor in Residence here at Berea College, and we're blessed to have the Bell Hooks Institute, which is the only one of its kind in the country, named for a living Black woman writer. And it is right down the street here. That's where we should probably be. We take a field trip. But it's right down here on Center Street. And that was founded in 2014. And we're so glad that she's here and glad that the Institute is here as well. So welcome.
Woo!
I'm already starting to sweat.
I thought we should dedicate our words to the loving memory of
Gloria Naylor. Another Black woman writer gone too soon. You know, we go too soon. So let's hold her in our hearts and in our memory, so she will always remain with us. I'm so excited to be here with all y'all beautiful Black women and other people. I'm excited, of course, always to be here with my sisters. My sister Gwenda called from Hopkinsville, like where we grew up, and said, "Why come you didn't tell me that y'all were having this conference?" I said, "It's because Crystal didn't tell us till a few days ago." Which is not true. But anyway, Gwenda came on up from Hopkinsville, and she's sitting next to Dr. Valerie, my sister worker here at the college with me. Both of them are my younger sisters.
Yes.
So, and then I'm up here with, she has 2 brothers,
I do.
but no sister.
No sister.
You can be my sister.
Thank you. Oh my God.
Now, okay,
That was my inside private.
how many of you have heard of Carolyn Finney?
Yes.
I ask though because there are so many of us working in the field of creativity and culture who never get noticed
That's right.
because we're out, she's out of her place. A geographer, a cultural geographer. What's she thinking? I know. Who does she think she is? And then she's going to start by telling you a little bit about herself and this amazing. I was thinking about the parallel when earlier we were talking about space and land with your life. And so you have to tell people a little bit about, because she's a New York-based country person.
I've never thought of it like that.
With us Kentucky-based country people.
Okay. It's my turn.
Yeah. You can have your own mic if I can figure it out. My phone hand doesn't want to do it.
Okay, so, because I always have to say where I'm from, and I was thinking earlier, when Joan was, you were talking about you were living in one place for 50 years. And that's
Awesome.
Which is incredible to me, but also really scary because I haven't lived in, the longest I've lived somewhere is 18 years, and that was the first 18 years of my life. And I've also been thinking about not ever being able to go back home again, which I won't ever be able to do. So I grew up in New York, and I'm always, even though I haven't lived in New York since the 90s, I'm always from New York, no matter how many times I move, and I move a lot. My parents, Rose and Henry, are from a small town. They're country people from Floyd, Virginia. I grew up in a little rural area, high school education, Black. In the 50s, when my dad came back from the Korean War, they decided to move to New York, like a lot of Black folks did, hoping to get a better opportunity. When they got to New York, my father got 2 job offers. One, he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York, which is about 5 hours north of the city. The other was 30 minutes outside of New York City. The Tishmans are a very wealthy Jewish family. They own a lot of land in New York City, including Rockefeller Center. They had a 12-acre estate, 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. They needed somebody to live on there full-time and care for that land, so my parents took that job. My father was the chauffeur, the gardener, the caretaker. My mom was the sometime housekeeper on that property. 12 acres, swimming pool, small lake, fruit trees, vegetable gardens, stunning, in a very wealthy white neighborhood. We were the only family of color in that neighborhood until the 90s when a Japanese American woman moved in. She's since moved out. To give you some idea of the wealth in that community, Harry Winston's got property down the street. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer used to live next door. Wingfield Golf Club was around the corner. And then there was us. It was like, I carry around, I'm so old school, I have some photographs actually, which I'll pass around because I carry around photographs of the place with me. I once pulled that out not long ago, and somebody who was under 30 was like, "Oh my God, you have photographs." The story that I always tell to give folks a sense of how I potentially started to think about the color of my skin in relation to living in this really stunning place. I was 9. I was walking home from school, so 4th grade, little afro, my reading glasses, highly unimpressive, walking home from school. There was always cops patrolling the neighborhood. A policeman stopped me. I was right around the corner from the house. He asked me, he was like, "Where are you going?" I said to him, "I'm going to 1000 Old White Plains Road," which is the address. And he said, "Oh, do you work there?" And I'm thinking, I'm 9. And so that kind of started this cycle of thinking about, all right, right, you know, and just in my own little 9-year-old mind kind of going. And I remember looking at him and going, no, I lived there. Like, I was really confused by why he would think I was working there. But my parents did work there, so that whole, I guess, sort of understanding what it means to live and work somewhere and who belongs and who doesn't. I sort of want to jump ahead a little bit because I don't want to talk, there's a lot of stories I could tell about being on that property. But in the late 90s, Mr. Tishman had died, Mrs. Tishman was really ill, and she had to figure out what was going to happen to my family, who had now been on this land for almost 40 years. Almost close to 50. And to her credit, she had a very close relationship with my father, and I tell people, you know, I never would say it to my father. I was like, it was a little bit like driving Miss Daisy, if you ever saw the movie. I'm not gonna say it with my hand. I've said it to a lot of other people. She had him by her bedside when she was dying. So it was that close, complicated relationship. And to her credit, she wanted to figure out how to keep my parents on this land. We lived in the gardener's cottage on the land. What I call the big house was also there, but the Tishmans only came up on weekends and holidays to that land. So in the end, for multiple reasons, it wasn't going to work for my parents to stay here. You need to know that in the 90s, that property was worth over $3 million. The property taxes alone were $125,000 a year. My dad had been making about $20,000 a year. Right? So she had a house built for them back in Virginia. They live in Leesburg, Virginia, near DC. My father calls it Sleesburg. He swore he was never moving back to the state of Virginia. That's a whole other conversation. But there's a beautiful home. It's all paid for. Mrs. Tishman passed away. New owner came on. My parents stayed on until a new family got sort of trained to be on that property. It's a family from the Dominican Republic, which I think is really interesting. And they moved to this house, which is on a half-acre of land, 2003. And my parents, in particular, my dad, has been very depressed ever since. Talks about New York, talks about missing the land. And he's always talked about land ownership because he's never had any and believed that's the thing he should have to hand down. So that's really what started me thinking about questions of ownership. Whose ownership counts? You know, this idea, is it all about a deed, or can it be also how much you love, know, have given yourself over to that land in a very particular way? And not a romanticized notion of what that is, but it's like your day. And you get up. My father was up every day, my mother was up every day. They knew everything that there was to know about that land more than the owners did. And then I started thinking about all the people in the history of our country who are invisible in those kinds of stories. And the idea of how work doesn't always translate as a way to know the land. There's something about that that's wrapped up in ownership that gets really complicated for me. The last thing I will say is, it was something I said at the end of the book, that we got a letter from, my parents got a letter from some of the neighbors. It was from the Westchester Conservation Land Trust. So they were sending a letter around to everybody in the neighborhood to say a conservation easement has now been placed on the land. And what that means is in perpetuity, nothing can be changed on the land. It named everything that was really important about the land, where it sits in the watershed, what kind of wildlife it had on the property and so forth. But what really got me was, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. And what I kept reading that one-page letter over and over, and I said, well, where's the thanks to the people who cared for that land for nearly 50 years? And so I have a very, like probably most of us do, sort of a complicated understanding of what it means to belong. I'm adopted too, that's its own story now. Ooh, if we had time, I could really go to town. But really thinking about place that, you know, I've been spending a lot of years talking about, the last few years, talking about my parents who can never go back. And actually it's a way for me to talk about the fact that I can never go back, but it's easier to talk about my parents than it is to talk about myself. So, yeah.
Which is, our stories are so both parallel and different, because of course I came back, along with those other two that came back. Valerie came back from California to Kentucky. Gwenda came back after how many years in Flint, Michigan? 37. And we've arrived where we started from, in Kentucky. So Carolyn writes in her book about Black people and exile. And it was first from Cornell West that I learned to think about Black folks as an exilic people, as a people who were constantly in search of home and a place of belonging. Because Carolyn also writes about all the land that has been taken from black people. And Kentucky is a really significant example of a world where lots of black folks owned land, that when white folks decided they wanted it, they just came and burned down places and ran people off and took the land. We grew up in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, as always knowing black people owned land. Owning land was the real marker of arrival. Not how much money you had, not what kind of car you drove, but what did you own, where did you live? And so for us, we grew up in Gainesville Hill. We started out in the Kentucky Hills, which were at that point racially integrated. I mean, I'm 64. So it was a very different environment in Kentucky. And Kentucky always perplexes me because there's so much awfulness here. And then there'll be these sort of magical moments that you'll hear about life here in Kentucky. I mean, just when I think about the fact that we're an hour and a half away from a Buddhist monastery, and it's like, really? Are we still in Kentucky? And so Kentucky is kind of this odd place where things happen, but where I think there's been a real painful sense for many black people in Kentucky of exile. I was asking Valerie, I try to interview these siblings and they don't cooperate. But I was asking Valerie, what was her relationship to land and nature? Because our parents moved from the hills into the city when she was a little girl. Gwenda, you weren't even much of anything at that point. But for me, my earliest memories are of land, of wilderness, of feeling completely free in nature. And all of that changes when we enter the city. So that is something to think about, that whole relationship of black people to rural space and to agrarian culture, and then the shift into cities. Because cities came to define black experience, not those of us for whom black experience was farming, sharecropping, walking the rows and rows of planted vegetables by Daddy Jerry, and all of that. To me, it took me a long while to realize that this was the black experience that was being hidden and covered up. So that our relationship to environmentalism, you know, one of the things I remember Daddy Jerry always saying is that white folks couldn't control the sun. They couldn't control rain. So that there was that whole sense of our humanity finding itself in the transcendent spirit of nature and of wilderness. Because you knew the limitations of whiteness. And we contrast that to an urban black experience where there's a sense that whiteness is all powerful. Whiteness defines every aspect of your life. So it always fascinates me that at times when there was such segregation, such poverty for blacks in the South, there was still this sense of we have a way of thinking about life that allows us to be in a transcendent spiritual place, irrespective of what's happening to us materially in this imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy.
Oh, now I'm at home. I know, just wait for her to get there.
Yeah, she was worried that she was up here with somebody else. You know, because the new term that everybody likes is intersectionality, which doesn't have much appeal to me because what does that say? But I think that when you say imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, it says where we are. And what's affected every single one of us in this room in terms of our identity, in terms of our movement in space. Because Carolyn's book is called Black Faces, White Spaces.
Yes.
So I want to talk more about Exile.
Yes, and so I wanted to give a
Because she
story.
is a total nomad.
I am, it's true. Yeah, it's true.
I've never met another black woman like her, and I'm serious, that she has been so many places in the world. She has no fear.
Well,
Well,
it sounds good when you say it, but I wouldn't say that I don't have no fear. I have a lot of fear, actually. There was a therapist couch here, and I could lay back. I'd love to get your feedback. But I want to talk about Exile. Two things when you were talking, but there was a story I remembered about my dad, and he's usually the one that I think about because he lives his life in a very particular way, and so it's just very dramatic in my mind. But so every year, we used to, when I was a kid, we used to drive, for the summer, we drive down to Floyd County, because my parents came from very large families, so lots of cousins. So it was like we had our New York during the year, and in the summer, we'd go down and spend a few weeks in Floyd, and I actually loved it. So going to the church revivals, like for me, it was just, I always tell people, I could tell by the music, because I went to a predominantly white high school, where I'd be listening to the Beach Boys, I'm not making this up, right, and the Beatles, unless I was at home where I was listening to the blues. And then I go to Virginia, and then it was all like the R&B of the 60s and 70s, right? But I hadn't been down there in like 30 years, and about 5 years ago, my family said, let's do a summer trip down to Virginia. So we went down. A lot of their family still lives there, that's still living, still lives there. But the thing that was moving to me is my father wanted to go see where his parents were buried and other members of the family. But in order to do so, it's on land that belongs to a white farmer. Because there's a whole complicated story about how that land left their family. So we went, and the farmer happened to be on his tractor, and he was a nice man, and he said, sure, come on in. And what had happened is all those gravestones were kind of in the middle of this land with a fence around it, like a wooden fence around it, and it was all overgrown weeds. And so he let us come in, but we couldn't actually go into the gravestones because of snakes, and it hadn't been cared for. It was, I don't know, there was something about even how in death there's a sense of exile, right? And so the individual for me is not the issue because he was a friendly man and he happened to own the land. But it's weird that my father has to come and ask permit. He is now 84 and he's still having to ask permission to see his dead relatives. There's something really wrong about that for me. And even though he wasn't making a big deal out of it, my heart was breaking the entire time. And so we were all having our pictures taken, standing next to the fence, not even next to the tombstone, you know? So that sense of connection, how it has to be nurtured in different ways because you can't always get that very material, you know, that you can go stand on the land. And where you don't have to ask permission to do so. What does that mean? I don't want to talk about my own exile because then, I don't know. I feel, I could say a lot about just a sense of being adopted actually for me it's always been a thing. So I think a lot about how we come to know who we are
and where we belong.
And where we belong. And so I think a lot about the fact of not knowing for me, not knowing. I have some really descriptive information. New York State is very hardcore about saying what you can't know about yourself. And DNA, the dominant narratives, you know, so the slave narrative, your biology, who raised you, where you're raised. And for me, I know there's a real search there to find out where do I belong, what am I connected to, who am I connected to, who do I look like, what does that mean? And I thought I had this story right, so I just want to say, because I found out some new information a few weeks ago from my DNA, and I thought the story was always, I had an African-American biological mother who gave me up because she was in college, and her black parents, one was a physicist for the government, the other was a home economics teacher. I mean, I got a lot of descriptive information in New York City, how I was adopted, and that my father, biological father, who they didn't see, was also African American, but they didn't know much about him until I had my DNA done. And I found out in the maternal, the mitochondrial line, there isn't a single drop of African blood on my mother's side. Which you know what that means. And so then I started thinking about all the ways in 1959 that this interracial couple could not own that, so that the lie was created. The whole lie, even you're giving a child up for adoption, there's a whole lie there. So I sort of haven't worked this out yet. I'm still processing it, and something I'm writing about this idea of, again, how do we think about belonging and how we lie, and we feel the need to lie around issues of race and difference, and even in the way we show our love and how we show our love and who gets to do that. And there's an exile from that experience as well that's somehow apparent to me. I don't know, I kind of went off there, but.
No, I was thinking how intense it all is, how the varieties of Black experience. You know, I'm standing here looking at the photo of a baptism, and I'm remembering my father. My father was late coming to God, and in terms of baptism. So we actually were present at his being baptized, some of us. And that sense of, for me, belonging starts, you know, with that deep sense of knowing who your people are. I mean, one of the questions my grandmother loved to ask me was, Glover, how can you live so far away from your people? Because her sense of belonging was in people and in the land that you came from as a people. And for us, I think, as diverse, diasporic Black folks, we're constantly in search of those roots and those places of belonging. I don't think that I ever felt understood when I left Kentucky and went to Stanford to school, and that the me of me, which I felt was so totally informed by Kentucky, even my blunt speech, which was the speech, the vernacular speech of my belonging, of my childhood. Bell Hooks, my maternal great-grandmother, was characterized by her open and blunt speech, so that as a girl going to the grocery store, mouthing off, I heard about Bell Hooks. Well, you must be Bell Hooks's whatever. So that you could go home and then ask your parents, you know, well, who was Bell Hooks? Because they didn't necessarily talk about people just like randomly. So that I think that sense of, I think Black people, I'm thinking about 13th, Ava DuVernay's documentary about mass incarceration. I'm thinking about so many media things that have happened recently to try to restore to us that sense of where do we belong. And isn't it interesting to think about prison as a kind of metaphor of belonging for African Americans, that, you know, not just the concrete prisons, but the sense of where we are trapped in the history of slavery, in the history of bondage, and how do we break out of that? We had Black philosopher George Yancey here arguing that white folks can never really be free of their racism, which made me really ponder, if white folks can't be free of their racism, can we as Black people be free of our internalized racism?
Yes.
And I think we can. I absolutely think we can. You know, it's just so interesting, because for us, breaking out of the prison really is the only way that we can claim our lives. That if we hadn't broken out, I was writing this morning at 4 a.m, I was writing about Sojourner Truth, you know, saying, you know, when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard. But what struck me about that, Carolyn, is that she's in the wilderness. She's out in nature by herself, and she is seeking solace there. And it is the God that is listening to her, that hears her cries, that allow her to have that subject-to-subject encounter, which, you know, psychoanalysts tell us is essential to becoming a person, that you have to be seen and heard. So who sees and hears us? I mean, I've been thinking so much about this and thinking about Black women writers like Lucille Clifton, Pat Parker, all of these Black women who died so young. And, you know, who is seeing us? Who is hearing us? Who is listening?
When you're saying, a couple of things I was thinking is just saying, you know, breaking out of the prisons, which for me partially implies we have to know what the prisons are, right? And there's a way within which I know that it's easier for me to talk about how I have been challenged by quote unquote white people and or the institutions they create. I can talk about that, and I have a lot of stories, you know, like why I'm still not at Berkeley, woo! And it's a little harder for me to talk about the ways within which those who look more like me have also challenged me in the same way. And in a way, ultimately I like to believe it always hurts no matter who does it. And there's a way within which, in terms of self-identification, when it comes from somebody who looks like me, it's a little harder. That I have to work harder to explain it, and explain it with a sense of love and compassion. That's like, I think I understand why you are saying that to me like this, but oh my God, it really hurts when you think that I'm trying to be something else. And yes, I am trying to be something else other than something that someone else has confined me to, a place and space that someone has confined me to. And I'm trying to figure out what that is. I'm not trying to be like anyone else, just trying to figure out who I am to be that. And so how do we collectively create a space that becomes possible? And there's a kind of fearlessness there as well. So I don't become afraid of something that, there's a few things I could say. So we were standing over in the corner, and she asked me if I knew who not who Maureen Betch was, but who Jeanette Cole is. Jeanette Cole, very well-known African-American academic, but her sister Maureen is who I got to know. And Maureen, as part of that family, if you don't know who Maureen Betch is, look up the Beach Lady. Maureen gave away all her wealth to environmental causes, all $750,000. I carry around a photo of her as well. Dreadlocks that she carries around in a wrap.
Have you heard of her ever?
I'm just telling you, when you look up the Beach Lady, Maureen, she's no longer with us, but I met her back in 2005. And one of the things that Maureen, she worked hard to protect American Beach. American Beach was created by her great-grandfather, who bought a black beach in Florida on Amelia Island back in the 40s and 50s in order for black people you could live on the beach and go to the beach during that time. And so she worked hard to get that beach protected with its sand dunes, its maritime forest.
I was thinking about Black people as the original homeless people of this nation, and that search for a place of belonging. Because no matter what was done to the Native people and is being done to Native people, there was always a sense that they had a land. And for African American people, there was always a sense that we were brought here. We did not belong here. And I do think it's interesting that despite the incredible work of Ibn Surdima that came before Columbus, about the Africans who came to the New World before Columbus, no one ever really talks about this. I mean, I'm personally bored with slavery, with slavery as the defining Black experience. I'm interested in that Black experience of those who came before Columbus, who felt like, oh, it's interesting here, but we want to go home. So what defined their experience was not the will to dominate, because part of what white folks had said was that the will to dominate is natural. The will to want to take over someone's land. And that's what their reasoning they gave for the genocidal assault on Native peoples. But in fact, when Native people and the original Black people who came here who were not slaves met, they did not meet in a dominating or colonizing process. They met as people who shared culture, who shared, one of the reasons we know that the Africans were here before Columbus is in food things, like certain strands of cotton that were only in Africa. How did they get here? They came with those Black folks. Certain kinds of foods that people use and ate. it's such a fascinating history that gets all of it sort of sucked up by the big vacuum of slavery. So that, don't you think it's interesting that we have all these movies right now about slavery?
Yeah, right.
Slavery and mass incarceration, like we can't get out of the prison of bondage and slavery. But the real us was never there.
That's right.
The real us had a home.
Yes, ma'am.
And we knew where we belonged and cherished where we belonged. And we see that cherishing of land in the slave narratives, in the efforts of Black people to own land and to hold on to their land. And that's the culture of Blackness that I grew up in, But the thing that's so interesting is to look at how quickly that culture began to be destroyed. I mean, you don't see those families in places like Kentucky, black families where, well, we had this land for years. Our own Alistine Turley is back on her family land. Jim Embry, the slow food movement, is back on his family land. So there is a kind of movement afoot here in a kind of reclamation of our sense of belonging. So that I'll be interested as Carolyn continues her journey of belonging to see what she defines as who I am and where I'm to be. I believe that home is inside us, and that part of where we belong is in what we make. For me, you know, coming back to Kentucky, the hills of Kentucky were not a safe place for us as African Americans growing up. And I think it's interesting that my house in the hills here is defined by so many people as not a safe place. So that what has changed for us? Well, what has changed for us is that I can, through ownership of this land, restore that sense of belonging, make sure the land doesn't exist to be ravished or developed, but that it can exist in its own existential beauty. And I think that there are lots of black people engaged in that individually. The black people you can learn about in Carolyn's book that we don't know enough about as African Americans. If you look at the films on environmentalism, black folks have been engaged with environmentalism from the very moment of its inception, but we don't hear about that. Instead we hear, well, why aren't there more black people in, why aren't there more black people? So to think about how those very questions end up silencing a history, silencing movements.
And also silencing people. One of the, early on when I was working on the book as a dissertation, so I was interviewing African Americans around the country, and I was out in Seattle, Tacoma area, and I was speaking to a predominantly brown crowd. And afterward, I asked, there was a black woman, I had asked the question, so, you know, what is your environmental story? And she just looked at me, she says, I don't have a story. And I went, everyone has an environmental story. And then she proceeded to tell me this amazing story about her son and watching the sunset. Like and then she turned to me, she says, nobody's ever asked me that before. And I said, and actually that's the point. Is right, that nobody has ever asked you that before, not that you don't have a story. And the idea, I mean, we can talk about we're talking about black people, but for me this is anyone. It's like this story here, but what story becomes the universalized way of understanding our collective relationship to non-human nature, as opposed to thinking that that story is complicated. It's a matter of perspective, it's a matter of experience, it makes it multidimensional. And we don't have to know all the stories, but somehow, how do we make space for more stories than what we have, so that more people feel connected? And I want to say this, because you said about you'd be interested to see where I land. I'd be interested too. But, and I mean but and not and. No, I mean and. I mean and. I've been thinking a lot about relationship, right? So relationship to other people, but also to non-human nature and place, and that if I could somehow be comfortable with finding home in relationship, then it's less dependent upon me landing somewhere specifically, right? And saying, here's where I have to be, here's how I have to be here. And maybe that's just my own need to feel free. Belle, I need to feel free. I'm serious about that. I need to feel free. I don't like to be told what to do. I'm sorry. Or how, more importantly, actually, I don't like to be told how I have to do it. That's the thing that's really frustrating to me. This is how it looks. I'm not saying, I'm not saying that you're saying that, that's not what I'm saying. Just sort of the general rules of the game, or the game. Like, you have to show up like this, and this is what you do, and this is how you're here in the community.
It's funny because I find it interesting that we are, Doris Davenport and I go back many years, and we're in a room with a lot of black people, Joan included, black women who have not wanted to be told what to do, who have wanted to define ourselves according to our own sense of being. And, and for that we are punished. And I think there's a reason that Phyllis Chesler, I'm forgetting the name of her book, where she writes about why so many feminist women have been ill and, suffered great health problems. Because I think that, when you decide to be yourself in the way we're talking about, Thich Nhat Hanh says, you're really alone. And I think that Black women who have decided to be themselves often live within that solitude of a certain kind of spiritual aloneness that isn't articulated in our society, because who's listening? I mean, when some of you know that I just brought Emma Watson here, and one of my Emma Watson, the actress who played Hermione in
I missed Hermione. Excuse me, I'm gonna be sick over here. I'm so sorry.
One of the reasons that I wanted to bring Emma here was that Emma goes, as the UN ambassador, global ambassador for women, that she goes all over the world. And what I wanted her to see was there are Appalachians all over the world. There are people living, you could go out, we know, those of us who live here know that you can go out and see people living in shanties, people living without essential food and shelter and heat right here. And that experience of Appalachia and the connection between belonging and poverty, I wanted her to see that this connects us to the world. This connects us to what women especially are experiencing in the world. 32,000 children die daily in the world from war, sexual predation, hunger, and illness. 130 some people die daily in the world. So that experience of, what is it we belong to? Do we belong to this imperialism that is part of what is choking the life out of so many people in the world? Or do we belong to this subcultural struggle of freedom, of crying out in whatever voices that we cry out in, like Sojourner? When I cried out in a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard. So that we are refusing to be voiceless, but we are still trying to define who we're speaking to. I was writing about the fact that in Kentucky, everyone looks to Wendell Berry as the great white writer of environmental issues. And so that no matter how many Black folk, individual Black folk write about the environment or their experience, it never gets elevated. It's like we're always in the shadow of that white voice, that white male patriarchal voice, which I always find interesting. It's very much also an upper class voice. It's not like your regular little white male farming person voice that stands for the voice of nature. It's so interesting that it's frequently the people who live in the greatest intimacy with the environment and with nature that have the least public voice about nature. We're going to stop and just open it up unless Carolyn has something she wants to add, for people to ask questions, for us to talk together.
Yeah. I never want to leave.
Your name?
Tamia. So I have a question. You said that you found out that your mother was white. How did that
I was hoping that would just go, woo! No, go
How
ahead.
did that impact your racial identity?
So I only found out like 3 weeks ago.
Oh.
So that's why. So the next project that I'm working on, the next book it's changing the way that I'm doing it, because I was looking at, you know, what it meant for my parents to grow up to live on that land, in terms of constructing their own Black imagination, and how their world was more limited than mine, even though we both grew up on the same piece of land outside of New York. And I wanted to look at sort of the dominant narratives around race, how Blackness gets constructed in the United States, the slavery narrative, which is a really popular one, as well as the issues of, I'm gonna hire somebody to find my biological parents, and then looking at DNA and culture. So I had this thing I thought I was doing in the story that I was going to tell, and actually, you know, that's really messed things up for me, right, in a lot of ways. So I've been thinking about the issue of belonging more broadly. That's where it pushes me to, right? Because actually, in the truth of it, and I never talk about sameness. I was reading something this morning, I was thinking, for me, it's not about sameness, and it frustrates me when people, in an effort and in a good intention to make us connected, talk about sameness, because it belies people's differences, which is what is so exciting about us as individuals, right? And at the same time, I'm interested in who am I as a human being. Who am I as a human being, and what does that mean? What this forces me to do personally is look at that diversity internally. So, you know, I realized I was raised Black. I knew there was something back there in the background, because there always is, you know, lurking, overseeing. But, you know, I didn't know really what it was, but, you know, I thought I was brought up as, I'm Black, I'm African American, this is who I am. I've had no problem claiming my African American ancestors as I understand them. But now I've got to claim my European ancestors. There are so many people listed in Finland that I'm supposedly related to. Finland? Like, I mean, for me, it's just like, I don't even know what to do with that information. So I'm hoping that what it does is forces me to face my own limitations. I can't talk about the thing if I can't do the thing myself. So I'm kind of caught in that moment of like, how do I think more broadly about who I am without losing what I've come to know as who I am? I don't know if that answered your question, because I'm still working on it, because it's only been a few weeks, but.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Aisha, oh, Ms. Teresa?
Could I ask you something? What does a hollow mean? You're in Kentucky, there are hollows. People that live in a hollow. Does it mean hoping they can
Holler.
No, it's,
I know black people that live in a hollow.
Holler.
does anybody here live in a hollow?
I grew up in one.
Yeah, well, tell me what a hollow is, Lynn.
It's a little valley
Where did they call it in history of it? Where did they call it?
southeastern Kentucky.
Why did they call it hollow? Because you could
Well, we
hollow.
call it holler.
Holler.
We call it holler because it's a.
Well, I'm in Texas, so it's a hollow.
It's a hollow between two hills where they came together.
And
formed
people
a
can't
valley.
usually see you.
It was, yeah.
The black people live in too.
But we could holler at one another.
But it was also about privacy and where you can be self-inventing. The people that I know, like right now, who live in hollers around here, they're not easy to get to. Frequently, you can't get to them in a regular car. And they're really, and if you know the history of the Maroons, that was part of why you could live in the swamp or you could live in the hills, because you could live in these places that couldn't be reached.
Thank you very much.
Aisha?
Yeah, I had a question all around, just in terms of enslavement. I mean, because I've never thought about, I mean, I've definitely read and loved, I mean, when I first read Ivan Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, but never thought about them going back and having a place to live and realizing that they had, going back to their home in countries in Africa. I'm just curious about your feeling of being frustrated about hearing about enslavement. I mean, do you feel like you've just heard enough about it, or?
That's right. I mean,
Okay.
when I saw 12 Years a Slave, I said, I can live the rest of my life without ever seeing another naked black woman raped and beaten. You think about these images and what they do to us. And think about all the images of black people that we don't know anything about. I mean, I was just recently introduced to the image of a black woman who was kind of a Florence Nightingale, but I'd never heard about her. I mean, just think about all the empowering images that we never hear about.
Like
But yes, but the slavery image, it's like constantly. I mean, I don't even know how black folk can, the struggle to even just be self-loving in the midst of an environment where you're constantly being assaulted by images. And like the image of the woman in 12 Years a Slave, that was not in the book. All of this kind of, so what does it mean that that image has to be created and put in there, that we have to be, as Black women, endlessly sexualized for reasons of violence and control? You know, and then, so where do we find our freedom as sexual beings? I mean, I just think all the time about creating space where I can exist outside the sort of predominant ways of shaping and forming my identity. I mean, even in opening the Bell Hooks Institute, I really struggled with, my ego really struggled with, I've always felt much more modest, and this isn't modest. It ran over to it right now. It has all of these images of bell hooks, mostly painted by the Black African-American artist Emma Amos, but it's sort of like, I kept thinking about Black women and Black writers in general, Black gay writers, thinking about Essex Hempel and other people who died, Jim Beam, people who died, but we don't know their legacies. Thinking about Langston Hughes' family, which doesn't want anything ever said about him being gay. You know, so when the film was made, Looking for Langston, they were not able to use any words from his poetry or anything because the family did not want him to be seen as gay. So I've spent these last few years, we lost a sister. She hadn't been sick, but she died, and it made me really think about, one, just, you know, as Mom used to say, life isn't promised. You don't know what's gonna happen. I kept thinking about, what am I doing for my legacy? How do I want to be remembered, my works to survive? Because all of us in this room who teach Black women know that our students frequently don't know who Audre Lorde is. They've never heard of Pat Parker. That we can be forgotten so quickly that it astounds me that we can enter this space of, so like I'm much more interested in, let's have images, one, that we've never seen before, experiences that we've never seen before. We don't need another image of a raped, brutalized Black woman. I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room has had more images of that being Black womanhood than anything else. I mean, just thinking about Joan's first video she showed us, just the magicalness of it. And I kept thinking, as I was watching it, so attacked. The more you will get sick, the more you experience stress. I mean, just the other day I had to go to the bank to do some, what do you call it, notarized stuff. And I had to ask a friend, because I'm suffering with arthritis in my hands, and to drive me. And she wanted to take me to a bank that I didn't know. And I said, no, I don't want to deal with white folks treating me bad today. I don't feel good. I need to get this done. And I was thinking about how, again, how many white people in our society live with that daily sense of, I've got to, I always think, put on the whole armor of God.
Come on.
Before I step out my door to go do some mundane thing, like go to a bank where all my money is, where they are benefiting from my money, and hope to be treated with respect. Hope.
Or when we're not sure. So 2 weeks ago I was in Utah and was giving a talk in Moab, which is about a 4-hour drive from Salt Lake City at a library. And so when I pulled in, they set me up in a lodge, and the lodge was a two-story building. And it's like that in Moab, if you've ever been there. That wasn't the problem. When I walked in to check into the room, it was a young white woman behind the counter. And I don't know what the truth is, but this is what was in my mind. So my thing is always to be, I'm in a town, Moab, there's like no Black people, or maybe 3 or something. and I'm aware of that I just look really different, so I overdo the friendly thing. Like I'm really just like, hey, I'm just trying to be like that.
You don't have to kill me.
Right. That was my bell hooks voice is sitting over here. I'm saying. And she just seemed like she just wasn't in a good mood for whatever reason. She gives me the key to my room. I go to my room. She must have given me the worst room because the way that it was set up in like a kind of half rectangle, each of them had one big glass window. All my window, what it looked at, when you pulled back the curtain, it looked at the garbage pail in the back of a stairwell. Right? So you pretty much could have given me just about any other room there, which would have been better.
Yes.
But here's the thing. So I struggled with myself in the room for about 5 minutes. Should I go back and ask for another room? Which I do, And I said, no, you're going to go back and just ask her nicely. Just ask her. And I was apologetic. Like I rolled up in that room just like, and there was an older white couple there who were waiting to check in. And I said, oh, I'm really sorry. I know you're really busy. I did that whole thing. I asked her, and she just said, I'm really sorry. There isn't another room. And I carried that with me, and then I went and gave my talk on black faces, white spaces, and then I talked about it at the end, because I had to say, the thing is, I still don't know the answer. The thing is, when I got back very late that night, the parking lot was packed, and I said, maybe it was the last room. But
It's never the last room. No, I mean, that's what I've learned, that especially in the world of hotels, they always have to keep a certain number of rooms available in case there's an emergency. Like, let's say there's no water. And when I learned that, I realized that because I've had that experience with, who knows, what was the year that black women were allowed to stay in hotels? We were not allowed to stay in hotels because it was believed that an individual black woman going to a hotel was a prostitute.
That's right.
And she was going there for reasons of selling. So we weren't allowed to even stay there. It hasn't been,
1978.
I'm
just guessing.
To me, I feel like I constantly face the room situation. And I think about psychohistory, like to give white people a break. I think that some white people do stuff they don't even know why they're doing. They don't even know why they're sending us to the shithole. They just are, it's like automatic to them to treat us a certain way that it's not conscious. It's not like, oh, black woman, I think she deserves to be in a really disgusting room. And I think that those kinds of things, these are the things I think those of us who are cultural critics who are working on white supremacy, how white supremacy articulates itself in ways that people aren't even conscious of. And so that I think, again, we would like all of you to leave thinking about black people and nature, the wilderness. Where do we constitute ourselves? I kept thinking about, when Carolyn's writing about black people not going to the parks, and I kept thinking that for so many of us, it isn't animals. It has been white people that we are terrified of, and terrified of being out of our place. Y'all who know me know I've been looking for love. I've not been successful. But I had this.
You're looking for wrong places.
I had this involvement for a while with this white policeman. Who would come to all of my bell hooks talks. And at one point he wanted me, this is in Michigan, he wanted me to come to his home. And I said, being the conscious black woman that I am, I can't come to your house. One, you have a gun. Two, I don't really know you. And I said, I could come to your house and we could get into a quarrel. And you could shoot me. And then you could be saying, well, she was actually soliciting in the airport. That's how she got to my house. And of course, this person thought that was absurd. How could you think that? And yet, this is a kind of critical vigilance that black people are constantly, non-white people are constantly living within, or we're having to second guess what can possibly happen to us in a particular situation. So that, I mean, how do you live in that and then be free? I still think that one of the reasons so many African American women constituted their home, Mary McLeod Bethune, starting Bethune-Cookman College in her living room, was that we had to make spaces of freedom that were outside the norm, the mainstream. So that I think, again, that to some extent, nature and the wilderness has meant that for Black people in a way that makes it even hard, because there are so few records. I mean, we can talk about the Maroons, but we don't have records of what it meant for Black people to live in swampland, to live hidden, to live with very little interaction. I mean, think about it. Can you imagine that? Is there any place in this country that Black people can live outside of white supremacy? I mean, I was thinking about who was the white woman actress that bought the town, and I was thinking, how come Black people haven't bought any towns where we have created the space where that issue of white supremacy is not dominant in our lives? Or we have created the spaces where we can show the world a level of hospitality. Because, you know, those of you who've been coming to the Institute, I have been really on this whole kick about the role of hospitality in ending domination and in allowing people to belong. And it's actually one of the defining features to close for me about Kentucky. That what I remembered most about growing up in Kentucky was the notion of hospitality, of courtesy to the stranger, of courtesy. You know how Black people be writing about how, yeah, we didn't want Missy to come over because that last piece of chicken, you know, that food was going to go to the stranger. It wasn't going to go to you. And that whole sense of courtesy and civility as being part of ending domination. And you think about all the Black people that have been killed in the last 5 years because they showed up as the stranger on some white people's property and in need, and they were shot. So that whole idea of what it means to be able to embrace yourself, the stranger within ourselves. For Carolyn, the search within herself. What form will that take in a culture that really doesn't even want her to think about herself? This culture would like us to be thinking about white people all day long, 24/7. And not about, well, what are we creating for ourselves? What is our relationship to the wilderness? I mean, I just want to say in appreciation to you and for your book, Carolyn's book really opened up for me so many names of Black people that I didn't know. Even though Robert Stanton had been here to Berea to talk, my sister heard him, Valerie, that he was head of the park services. We know so little. So, you know, if we just take our gaze away from the dominant culture and place it on ourselves, if we are listening to the drumbeat that is our heart, that is our being, that we can go back into that world that Joan creates in the first video that we saw, where we are at the center, where there is, I mean, think about that video. There's no encroaching, assaultive experience at all there in that experience. We thank you for coming. It's a great day ahead, so relax, let's have lunch. We thank Crystal. We know that Crystal has gone through a hard time with the death of her mother. You know how us Black people are. My mother used to say, you never have another mother. It used to annoy me to no end, but she was right. And Crystal has been living within her grief and at the same time taking time to create this conference and to welcome us. So we thank you, Crystal.